do you see? This is an example of one of the objects that we have in our museum, and it might be quite difficult to know what you're looking at when you see this object. But maybe this will help you to understand what you're looking at. Actually, you can see it's the bowl of a spoon, a Roman spoon to be precise, and maybe this will even give you a better idea. You can see the spoon hanging on the wall in the middle in a virtual recreation of a Roman kitchen. Now this refers to the research that we've done. This is Christy Ray, I'm Vaart. We're both PhD candidates at the Amsterdam School of Heritage and Memory Studies. It's a new school, so I keep forgetting the name. We're based at the Albert Pierson Museum in Amsterdam. The museum is part of the university. Now the Albert Pierson Museum is quite a traditional archaeology museum, so they have various collections, Roman, Greek, Egyptian, and the displays are quite traditional. And while the museum was planning to redevelop its Roman galleries, we had the opportunity to explore the way the museum displays its objects, particularly Roman everyday objects, because as you saw in the example before, often these objects aren't very engaging. They don't really pull the visitors in like maybe a Van Gogh painting would, or a Rembrandt, where people kind of feel what they're looking at, and people often don't quite know what they're looking at when they look at these old objects. So we had a hypothesis, which was that if we would virtually recontextualize the objects, then that would help visitors to engage with the objects and to understand what they're looking at. And that's what we explored with a pilot called the Domus pilot before we worked on the final exhibition. Now, while we made that pilot, we had two main questions. Does virtual recontextualization help visitors to engage with physical objects? And how can instructions help visitors to engage with and understand the installation? Because the virtual recontextualization allowed people to kind of explore the house, the Roman environment, and to walk through it, and that required some skill from the visitor as well. So how can instruction help them to do that and then get the most out of the experience? So I will talk about the first question, and then Christy will take over and talk a bit more about the second question. First, I'll show you a short video to explain you what the installation was like. The Domus installation, it starts automatically. Of course it doesn't. That always happens, it doesn't. Okay, well I'll just explain it then. Basically, it consisted of two parts. First, visitors entered our new media lab, which was a dark space with a big wall projection of a Roman house. We used Kinect to allow people to kind of navigate the space by movement. So if they would step to the right, the camera angle, as it were, would turn to the right. If they would step to the left, the camera angle would turn to the left. Stepping forward meant moving forward. And visitors were given a task. They were given the task to collect 7 objects in the house. So they would walk through the house, they were given audio hints as to where they could find the objects. And by pointing at the objects, they would collect them, and they would appear in the bar at the top. If people succeeded in collecting 1 or more objects, at the end of the experience, they were given a code. With that code, they could go to the display case, which had the original objects in it, and they could get more information about those objects. So first, we introduced them to the virtual environment and get them engaged, and then we asked them to look at the real objects. So, did virtual recontextualization help our visitors to engage with the physical objects? I think the answer is yes and no, which is often the case, of course. What we did guided visits, interviews, and questionnaires. So, first was a guided visit, then we had an interview with them afterwards and asked them to fill out a questionnaire as well. And we had 9 visitors who kind of did the whole experience the way I just described. So first the virtual environment, and then they looked at the real objects. And then we had 8 visitors who first looked at the real objects and then engaged in the virtual environment. And our expectation was that the visitors who had encountered the objects in their original context, and had seen the spoon in the kitchen and the bucket next to the well, would engage more with the objects on display. Now, how do you measure engagement? That's always tricky, but what we decided to do was to ask people, while standing in front of the objects on display, we asked them, so which objects do you find interesting? What would you like to know about them? And we also asked them later, after the entire experience had ended, do you remember where you found certain objects in the house and why were they there? And it turned out, actually, that the people who first looked at the real objects and then engaged in the virtual experience did better. They asked more and more diverse questions about the objects on display. They, when we talked about where they found the objects in the house, they actually referred to the content they'd seen in the touchscreen in front of the real objects, so they could link both the experience with the real objects and the virtual experience, and they could combine that information. They were better at remembering where the objects were located, and most surprisingly, I think, they were better at navigating the virtual space, which we found really surprising because they weren't given any extra instructions. So what happened? Clearly it does help people to, you know, look at objects first and then look at the virtual space, and they're able to reflect between those two experiences, so that helps them engage probably. But yeah, the order needs to be the other way around. So we wondered what happened here, and we think that key here, and I think this also touches upon the museum fatigue that was mentioned yesterday. Steve Bitgut describes how attention everywhere, but also in the museum, is limited, motivated, and selective. We don't have an endless supply of attention. And what happened when we took people kind of from the relatively traditional experience of the museum, of looking at objects and not encountering much technology, and we threw them in this space where there was a connect and they had to actually move and do things to navigate a house, that was a really big step. And it was quite challenging for people to navigate the house as well. So it asked a lot of their attention. And they kind of felt like, you know, because it was difficult, people often don't say, well, the system's wrong. They say, oh, I'm really dumb because I don't know how to do this. So their motivation kind of went down a little bit. And then when they were at the display case, they weren't that interested anymore. They were kind of done because they made a fool of themselves in front of us. And, you know, now they just wanted to carry on with their visit. That's kind of the assumption that we have. Whereas when we first took them to the display case, where we showed them the objects, which was something they were already doing in the museum, they were already looking at objects, and we asked them, what do you find interesting? What do you want to know? Those are questions you can't get wrong. So they're very open questions, and they kind of thought, oh, okay, yeah, I can do this is interesting, and they engaged with the touchscreen, which is a little bit of digital, you know, and you have to physically do something, but it's not too complicated. And then they felt more comfortable when they were sent into the space where they could do the physical navigation, and they weren't as nervous, and they actually performed better because the gap between kind of the activity they did first, which is looking at the objects with the touchscreen and talking about it, to what they did after that, the navigation, was smaller than when we gave them the navigation first. So this kind of brought us to conclude that we already knew that the virtual experience should always be embedded in the museum visit, both physically and intellectually. So both kind of in the look and feel of the space, but also how you talk about things, the kind of information you give them. They can't be two separate experiences. But now we will pay extra attention to also embed it in the kind of flow of the museum visit more, so that it's not just kind of they encounter something that's quite advanced technologically and they can have to do all sorts of things all of a sudden, but we'll try to kind of ease them into that a bit more. So I will hand over to Christina.
So when you have a rather complex interactive installation, as this one was, we repeatedly asked ourselves how instructions could improve the experience for visitors and help them engage better. So to kind of evaluate this, we looked at two groups of 20 visitors. They were not recruited to participate, they were just naturally occurring. We didn't want to impact their behavior by telling them they were going to be observed. And we took them used two different forms of instruction. So for the first group, we had the original sort of storytelling instructions. So this is a still of the video that you would have seen before. You're kind of embodied as a character. You're asked to explore this virtual house and find these objects to fulfill your family archive. It was a real quest-driven sort of fictional narrative to motivate visitors to explore the space, to find these objects, to get the code that would take them on gallery. And separately, in the second version, we had a panel, a text panel just on the wall for both versions. But the second version, we took that text panel and we really put the instructions for how to navigate in this virtual space in front of the user. So rather than getting the whole fictional storytelling aspect, we really explained, this is how you step forward, this in the interaction, this is how you turn right, this is how you collect objects. But there wasn't really a quest. There was a small hint about a time limit, but it wasn't a quest like it was for the second, or for the first set, sorry. So if we look at what was included in the instructions that we use and compare them to this, this is Emily Morell's Principles of Instruction. This is very much boiled down and goes into a lot of depth about each aspect, but you can see instructions ideally, and this is mostly for education, but instruction should be demonstrated, applied, task-centered, and activating relevant previous knowledge, but also integrated with everyday life. Now, this last one is a little bit difficult with an interactive Connect-based application. Many of our visitors are sort of 60 plus and probably aren't gaming with this kind of thing at home, so that's a little difficult. But if we look at the two versions, you can see instruction A was really task-centered. It really motivated visitors to explore the space. They really wanted to find the objects, to get the code. And for the second set, it was really, we had a small icon to demonstrate, and it was really more of how to move, how to move through the space, how to collect the objects, but not saying, you know, the objects are back here, or this object will give you this content. So it was kind of divided between the two. And what we found with the users, when the users just observing them, the first group, despite their challenges with the navigation, they were really driven, motivated to find the objects. They struggled, and they were more likely to give up because of failing in the navigation, but they were really motivated to try and find more objects. Whereas the people who had the second instruction, that was basically how to, they knew, they were really confident in their navigation, but they didn't have that motivation to find objects, to explore the space really further. So we knew that there was something missing from both instructions. Interestingly enough, both groups had a relatively similar interaction length of time, between 2 and 2.5 minutes. So for us, that is not an indicator of successful interaction or successful instruction in this case. So to conclude both parts, the virtual museum experience really needs to be built up. It needs to be integrated into the entire exhibition experience. And of course, the instruction should not only instruct but also motivate. You need to say how, but also why they're interacting with these applications. And actually, these conclusions have we've been able to apply them in our new exhibition, Keys to Rome, where we first given the storytelling and then built up the instruction and then built up the interaction. So it's really good for us to apply these already.
And the kind of last, the navigation through the house is kind of the most complex digital installation. We've now moved to the back of the exhibition, and we can see that helps, that people are kind of a bit more willing to try out more things and to experiment with it, and they're not as self-conscious as they were when they were right thrown into it.
Good job. Yes. So when you said that you were observing them but did not tell them, in research, academic research, you actually have to tell them. You can't observe them. So were you recording them? Were you just simply...
I was standing just outside of the interaction space, just kind of passively observing them. I had a sort of template of what sort of they were doing, but mostly I was recording to see which part of the instruction they were looking at, because we had not only the on-screen stuff, but we had the how-to instruction printed on the wall. So it was always there for everyone, but they weren't dividing their attention from the on-screen content.
I understand. I'm just curious about the research methodology, because in US we cannot observe anybody without them knowing what they're doing.
Yeah.
Simply that.
I'd like to continue on that I think that also the numbers were not that high, but also their age group and their knowledge and the motivation of the people.
Yeah, we recorded all that for the people that we the people that we did the guided visit with, so they obviously knew we were there, and they filled out information as well about how often have you visited the museum, you know, so do they have a collection, where are they interested, do they know what a Roman house looks like, do they, and their age. But it turned out that all those parameters, there wasn't much kind of variation there overall, so we didn't really mention it here. We just highlighted the things that we found interesting, and it didn't really seem to matter much if people kind of, and a lot of people interestingly said, like, oh yeah, I know what a Roman house looks like, and then when we did talk to them in the interview afterwards, it was very clear that even the basic structure of a Roman house they really didn't
But
know.
I think what would make a difference whether they love Kinect and they have been playing Kinect at home in the age group. And another point is that I don't know if it's allowed just to record interaction.
Right.
And because that if you, in other contexts, I noticed that already if you are present, that makes a difference. If they know that you are making a PhD on this, that makes a difference.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we didn't video record them, because then we would be required to tell them beforehand, we're going to video record what you're doing, so then they would be kind of more aware.
But I think this is just a wonderful prototype, right? Because anytime when we apply technology, try something, and then we learn so much. Whether, you know, very, you know, official or formal way, but I think it's really helped to develop this, you know, new interactive for the audience, and I think even help us to understand, you know, sometimes contextualization happen later instead of happen in the first place. So I think prototype is the key to make a successful, you know, whether in a very formal way or some way, but I think I definitely encourage everybody who does technology, you gotta do a prototype and then make sure that will work, right? And you got a wonderful finding. But I'm sitting one last question before we go next one.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's just a comment to the methodology. I'm from Denmark, and I did my project in a similar way as Neil. And I also did just observation, but I was standing also outside the interaction point, so I didn't listen into the conversation. I was just listening, and as I always do when I visit museums. I'm a museum person. I can't even go to a museum now without observing what people are doing. So I was just standing in the same way with my schedule and noting. And as far as I know, it's okay. It's also okay in Denmark to do.
Yeah, just a simple observation.
Yeah.
Sometimes, yes, you have to notify people, but again, a lot of visitor studies inform us, right? Observation.
In the UK, we need to put a sign at the front of the museum saying today we are. But it doesn't mean people have read the sign, but legally we need to put a sign.
But that's just the basic, right? Just the basic.
I would say that in your publishing, then you have to say it is informal.
Absolutely.
You cannot really publish otherwise.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's the rule. So we all need to follow either in a different situation, but I think the simple observation definitely help us to understand.
And we had aimed for higher numbers, but we were struggling to get those just because of the number of visitors coming through, and at a certain point that space had to be given up to the new Roman gallery, so we simply had to stop. We spent many hours on gallery just to get these numbers, so yeah, sometimes that's also a restriction.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Thank you, this too.